I really want to talk about something that I think is coming up more and more if you study human-robot interaction and the issue of trust between humans and robots. And so in particular, I think I'll start off with a little bit of background here. I think we all know if we do this idea of the future work, I get calls about are robots going to take human jobs, right? And I'll say, no, not all the jobs. I mean, humans are pretty useful. So the future workforce is going to be humans and robots working together. I think most people can actually agree on that. And so the idea of this collaboration requires trust, most certainly trust, right? So there's a lot of the stuff I hear about. There's a lot of research on human, and I'm sure I was obviously this workshop between humans and trusting robots. And I think we all agree that's an important topic, but I'm beginning to see more and more that's where the agreement ends. And this came up recently. I was giving a talk on trust repair, some work done by my student, Esther Wood. We were talking about trust repair and repairing trust between humans and robots in this very collaborative way. And then an audience member told me that he did not believe humans can trust robots, at least not any way in the way they would do humans, like in terms of work relationship. It was impossible. It actually didn't, And so it hit me for a while because there's been a lot of work on humans and robot trust, and there's been different measures, and some of the measures have been more interpersonal in the sense that we've treated, and I'll go a little bit further here to give you a better example of this. This idea, and it speaks to how we study humans and robot interaction. You can imagine one view of this is the robot is a tool. And there's a lot of work in human factors on human trust and automation. That's kind of working that. And the other view is that human views the robot as a teammate. And there's a lot of work on this idea of humans and robots working together in a collaborative way as the robot as essentially a coworker or a peer. And it speaks to the underlying idea when you study this, when we as scholars study this interaction, how should we go? Now I'll take a step back. I sit in two worlds. One, I'm in the School of Information, University of Michigan, as a professor of information, and much more human-computer interaction research. I also have an appointment in the robotics department, which is in the College of Engineering, much more technology focused. And so when you go between those two worlds, you can see vastly different views of the role of a robot. One sees it mostly as automation, like any other tool, and the other one sees it under this idea. I'm sure we've all heard this before. Computers as social actors, right? And so I take a step back, and I thought, okay, I've always assumed this view of computers as social actors, and how I studied robots pretty much as social actors. But am I wrong? Am I wrong? Have I been doing this right? Have I been doing some hokey stuff here? Like this guy accused me. He said, "Oh, this is BS. I don't believe this, and this is hoopla." And I realized, first of all, for my own defense, I made it clear this was not my idea. I was not the first person to study humans and robot trust. Okay, so don't blame me. I'm just following. But the idea is there's a growing consensus in areas like human-machine communication, where people are believing that no, robots are not social actors, and humans don't view them like other humans. And so it sort of got me thinking. This idea of computers as social actors, is it valid? Is it really valid, or maybe when is it valid? Right, good question. And this has implications for everything we study. We study a lot of things with trust, right? As we can see. And how do we study those things? So when we study human trust with Alexa, is it an automation trust? Because there are measures of automation trust, or is it more like a trust in interpersonal, or is it something totally different, totally unique, right? And so one way to take this, we look at it right here. So one way to look at this is there's like at least three different ways to understand trust and robots. So there's the idea of interpersonal trust, which is from the organizational behavior literature. There's the idea of automation, which is mostly human factors. They got human factor measures. Then there's information systems, who study trust and technology. And then there's new measures coming out that are saying basically that, a robot, I guess, is so different than any other technology that we need measures for robots. Now, you can argue that you could say, well, it depends. And obviously, the first thing that comes to mind would be the degree of anthropomorphism. But if you ever looked at those items and you have to use those items, you'll find they don't really capture a lot of anthropomorphism, right? At least not in that sense. It's not clear to me that that's going to tell you which way to go. So it sort of brings me to this bigger issue. One, is there a valid way? Is there one valid way? Right? Is it right? Two, is there something that determines that we can all agree on? Right? That we can say, yeah, it does. And three, the bigger question is, does it really matter? Empirically, I would probably assume that trust measures correlate heavily. Like I don't empirically, if you wanted to use trust to measure humans' behavior toward a technology or any object, I would find it hard to believe that any measure of trust wouldn't be predictive or as predictive as other measures of trust. And if that's the case, are we really talking about a philosophical difference? Are we really trying to argue and say that there are these philosophical differences that have to be addressed? Or is it really an empirical difference? So I don't have an answer for that. I put this up as computers are not social actors. I don't know. I do think a lot of what we having this conversation about really hinges on that. It's an assumption that I came into the field assuming. People always bring it up, but other people are beginning to push back on it. So I would say going forward, so one of the things I hope we all do is to be patient with each other. I've had reviewers push back, oh, you can't do that. Those trust measures are for this or for that, or they're not for robots. I think we're going to take a while before we figure this thing out, right? And so in the meanwhile, I would avoid rejecting papers due to personal opinions or agendas. Let's be open. I mean, this forum is a great example of that, right? Let's let scholars grow, develop, and learn, and we'll probably get a better answer at the end of the day, even though it may take some more time if we're patient with each other, right? So I would say be open to many approaches. Be open to many approaches in the short run. We do not know the answer to these questions yet, and people can claim to know. But if we knew, we would say, see this paper or that paper, and here's the answer right here. We all have a consensus on that, right? It's clear to me that we don't have a consensus on that. And you can look around today and you will see that. So, let's not claim that anyone has the right answer. And remember, any differences, at least empirically, if someone has a study, I would say in many cases, a lot of different measures of trust are going to be as predictive as any other measures of trust, for better or for worse. And so these differences are not likely to be empirical or predictive. They're likely to be philosophical differences going forward. So one, I want to say, I think this is an important thing, and I see it creeping up. I see it growing, and I see more so as you begin as HRI scholars or scholars of robotics and trust, as we're going to go to different fields, or as other scholars in other fields begin to come over to our areas. I see more and more pushback and a lot of things that we thought were, already tried and tested. The idea, if someone uses an items or an approach that's been published in the past multiple times at top venues, that it was valid. I see people now pushing back on that in many different areas. And so I think that's, going to be the next big thing, and how we deal with it as a community is going to be very important. So that's all I have, and we're open to any questions if we have time. Sure.
Thank you. Yes, we do have time for questions. So I do have a question. So there is more, I don't know if this is the right place to ask this question, but I'll do it anyways. And then, I'm sure John also has some questions. So we had a very interesting discussion also this morning about these things and the philosophical perspective is something that is very fascinating. So my question is, you mentioned people are pushing back now and maybe realizing things are more complicated, and we were assuming robots to be more like humans, but maybe not. But I do wonder, what about like funding agency, for example, that pay for our research? Do you think there's this awareness spreading from us researchers to the funding sources that maybe still push forward the previous CASA approach?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the problem. I think the answer to that, it all depends on who's on your panel, right? So for example, if you got, several people who are active in the area, don't have a problem with, are open to different approaches, it probably won't come up. If there's one person on that panel who says, no, this is wrong, this is invalid, we got to do something about it, we got to stop it right now, that person is likely to do whatever they can to kill that proposal, right? And so I think that's the problem that I'm having, is that, you have young scholars and they're moving forward with their career, and I don't want their work to be casualties of this conversation. It shouldn't be something that we should be open. It's like, we'll get the answer by doing more research and different types of research and different approaches to research. And this is why I want to spread this out, so that if someone is on a panel and someone says, no, I don't agree with this approach, someone can push back and say, hey, look, we don't know. Maybe we can ask that person to add another measure or another approach in their study, right? And that will be a better way to address the issue than to completely shut it down or reject a proposal or a paper.
Anyone else from the panel has a question?
Yeah, maybe me. Hello. So, I am wondering, so I mean, I like this positive view, but in the end, if we accept all approaches, it's staying really fuzzy, isn't it? So, I mean, one of the key problems we're having in trust research, we have, as you also mentioned, we have different domains in which trust is investigated. We have many different disciplines. And in the end, this leads, by nature, I would say, it leads to confusion and availability of really, really different definitions, measurements, approaches, and so on. And I think at least some of them cannot coexist.
So let me say, I would say one, life is messy. Life is messy. That's the way life is. Right? And that's reality. Reality is messy. Two, I think I don't disagree with the idea of building consensus. I'm just arguing about how we go about doing that. Like I don't think we go about it doing it by having competing views and I'm not saying that you're saying that, but I'm trying to say let's build a consensus in a much more cooperative, patient, and positive approach. To me, I believe that you put as many ideas out there as possible, and then over time we get better answers. And I think holding back research is what's going to hurt all of us. Like someone saying, "Oh, I don't like that approach. Don't publish that paper." I think that's counterproductive. And so I agree with you on the consensus. I'm just proposing a way of getting there.
Yeah, of course, we should value other approaches. I mean, that's really different, important. Also, because we have different disciplines working together, and it's just different approaches and viewpoints. So we really have to learn the language of each other as well.
Yep.
So this is really, really important, and I totally agree with that. But also, I think it is important to.
But I would say it's hard, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, it's really hard actually, and that's also what we realized here. I mean, in the morning we had a lengthy discussion with John, who is a philosopher, and he's waving right now, and it was really interesting how different the approaches in the end, right? So, like, I'm a psychologist myself, and it's so interesting how different the viewpoints are. But whatsoever, my career in the beginning, I was working on trust in automated driving. Then I approached the field of human-robot interaction. Recently, I'm doing research in interaction with AI systems, so ChatGPT and stuff like that. So, but I'm still working in all these three areas. And the discussion about trust is so differently in these three areas, for example. Yeah, and yep. I'm informed, right? You were at the Auto AI as well. Mr. Roberts, right? Have you been at the Automotive UI in Ingolstadt? Yes. So you're also doing research in different areas, and I find that really interesting, and the approaches are so differently. And so you mentioned like some researchers in human robot interaction are saying, well, trust in robots is different from other trust or other trusting agents, and I find that really confusing because when I'm like, as a psychologist, I have to assume that when we call something trust, it's still the same psychological experience in the end, right? And why should the trust in an automated car, for example, be so different from trust in a robot? I understand that a car is not the same like a robot, or at least the robot we all have in mind when we hear the word robot for the first time. But in the end, the robot, in average, is more human-like than a car, right? So it should be more closely to the original concept of trust in the end, and more similar.
Yeah, well, yeah.
So this is why this argument I find really hard to understand. So what's your viewpoint on that?
Yeah, you know, I think that I don't know the answer to that yet. I'm interested in finding out. On one hand, I think trust is trust, and I do think, in the sense that, you know, it's the attributes of what you trust in, like, you know. But I've talked to people who've told me on here on campus that you can't trust something that doesn't have agency, and that machines don't have agencies, and so trust doesn't actually exist. And I'm not saying they're right, but I'm saying there are people who have that opinion, and so how do you reconcile those things? I tend to believe that, you know, I've thought in the past that people see technology that they interact with, that they work with, very much as social actors. So I'm kind of like you. I would see this similar types of trust, but I'm also aware of different opinions, and I'm open to different opinions.
Yeah, John, please.
Yes. Hey, yeah, thanks for that, Lionel. It was excellent. So one distinction I think that would make things a lot easier to sort of make sense of is to distinguish the descriptive from the prescriptive, right? So there's the one question of, do we actually anthropomorphize these tools and treat them like we do humans, and so come to trust them? And then there's another question, which is the one I'm more interested in, which is the prescriptive, which is, ought we to be doing this? Mm-hmm. Are we justified?
Yes.
And if
so, that's a good point, because here's what I'm afraid.
Right. Then
I'm afraid that guy in the audience who told me that.
Yeah. Like what?
So I see exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. I just wanted to say this. I think like it's breaking up and there's a bad connection. I just want to say one thing, and then I'll have you hear your thoughts. And if we are justified or we're not justified, I think it's important to ask what justifies it. Like, you know, what must the trustee, a robot or a human, possess in order for us to be right?
I mean, those are good questions.
You know, I think keeping the descriptive and the prescriptive apart are really important here, because people do all kinds of things and they shouldn't be doing them. And we can predict, will someone trust, will someone not trust, while at the same time saying they really shouldn't be, right? So, okay, that's your thoughts, please.
There's a delay. Yeah. Lionel, would you like to expand on your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I'm just afraid that some people who don't think we ought to be trusting robots are going to use that as a hammer to shoot down research for people who are doing the, you know, you mentioned the other types of research, right? I do recognize that there are people like Ben Snyderman I know who don't think we ought to be doing that, don't think people ought to be researching that, and I see the point of that too. But I do think I like the idea of keeping it separate, because I think that's a very important element of the conversation. I think that's a very important part of the conversation.
Okay, then thank you very much, Lionel, for this thought-provoking, as you anticipated, talk. Thank you very much.